Matthew Perry was so similar to the wisecracking character he played in Friends, Chandler Bing, that when he first read the script in 1994, he said it was as if somebody had followed him around for a year, stolen his jokes, and aped his world-weary yet witty view of life. It wasn't that I thought I could play Chandler. I was Chandler, he said of the character, who was known for such one-liners as, "Hi, I'm Chandler, I make jokes when I'm uncomfortable," and "I'm not great at advice. Can I interest you in a sarcastic comment?"
All right, forget hypnosis. The way to quit smoking is you have to dance naked in a field of heather and then bathe in the sweat of 6 healthy young men.
Or what my father calls Thursday night.
Welcome to Last Rites. When Matthew Perry died, it was devastating to an entire generation of people who had grown up watching the TV show Friends. He obviously died in October 2023. So this week we are taking a slightly different tack where we are using the example of Matthew Perry's life and death to explore the process of writing obituaries. Because Georgia, you had a very unique relationship to Matthew Perry's death because you wrote his obituary for the Times.
Yeah.
And in rather unusual circumstances, which we'll come to. But before we get on to Matthew Perry, I wonder if we can start by you just explaining how obituaries normally work. How is it that you decide who to write about, and what's the process of writing them?
I get given maybe 2 or 3 people to write about each week by my editors. Sometimes I suggest them. And in terms of the process, it takes a couple of days, and I steep myself in the research of the time period, of the industry they worked in. I read their memoirs, I read interviews. I often interview family members, which can be incredibly interesting and difficult. And often they come out, they're published weeks, months after someone dies. So it's not a kind of newsworthy immediate event, which someone like Matthew Perry was. And in terms of who we pick, I always get asked this question because people assume that if you've done something significant within an industry, we're automatically going to do an obituary, right? So very, very often we get pitched academics who have written, interesting research, but they've had somewhat dull lives. And to be honest, that doesn't always merit an obituary because as you're reading it, you're thinking, Christ, this is slightly boring.
Slightly. Was that your assumption that academics have boring lives?
No, of course yours is fascinating, Sam. But it's more that, I think an obituary has to be a good yarn through and through, because obituaries are editorial. They're not for the family. They're not a paid for feature. So we want our readers to be fascinated, moved, entertained by this story, because it's the only bit in the paper really that's not completely news. Features are even news, arts is news. Obituaries are mini biographies. They should edify and entertain. And so what we're really looking for is a brilliant story, an interesting idiosyncratic story, or a window into a fascinating time and a person who had an incredible impact on that time.
Okay, so lots of obituaries you write will be about unknown people who you think people should know about.
Yeah.
And I suppose part of the craft is you drawing attention to these fascinating but less well-known lives. But obviously sometimes when someone dies, it is a news event because they are very famous. And as I understand this, you often have already written these people's obituaries because they are so famous, and there is this sort of pressure when they die for you to get something out quite quickly. So is that right, that you've often written them before these people have actually died?
Yeah, this is one of the quirks of the industry that fascinate people because they think it's rather morbid. We have what we call a stocks, a kind of mega file of thousands of obituaries we've written before people die when they are still alive. And these range from people who are very elderly, so who are about to die, to people who are really, really famous. So if they die, we need to have something ready. And they get written often 20, 30 years before someone's death and then updated. So they become a kind of patchwork of different writers, which is one of the reasons why we don't have our names on obituaries, because very often they're a collaborative effort. And I love writing stock obituaries in a sense, because you get to write about the Matthew Perrys of this world. But sometimes it can be a bit of a difficult task because often I'll inherit a stock obituary of, let's say, an actor from the 60s, 70s, and it will be written in an incredibly dry tone, which, when it was written, let's say in the 80s, was in vogue. So obituaries have only recently become this kind of anecdotal, creatively, not almost novelistically written piece of art. They used to be very formal in tone. They would be kind of very dry CV-like lists of achievements, which were eye-wateringly dull to read. So often when I inherit these stocks, I will do a complete overhaul and, rip the carpet up and completely start afresh, because if I offer this to our readers, they will put their cup of tea down and close the paper.
Okay, so if you're very old and famous, you're likely to have an obituary. So presumably David Attenborough has an obituary.
Yeah, he's the big. He's
Presumably
the big one. Yeah.
the Queen would have had an obituary written before. I suppose I'm going to, this is quite intriguing. So I want to go through a few names and I want to ask you if they probably have an obituary yet or not.
Yeah.
So you mentioned someone who's very famous. So would someone like Harry Styles have an obituary?
Well, that's actually fascinating because no, I doubt he would in most papers. Well, do you know what? I
because
think
he's too young.
because he's very young, and Matthew Perry's a really good example of this. And I know we'll get onto this later, but when someone is below the age of 50 or 55, you assume, they're not going to die anytime soon. But if they're famous enough, like Harry Styles, we would have to rush to get an obituary out, ASAP, which means that my editor is constantly exploring, refreshing the kind of long list of stocks to see who we need to get ready, because we live in a 24-hour news cycle. And most papers have pressure to get something out as quickly as possible. So now, if someone like Harry Styles dies, if we don't have a stock obituary ready, and we probably should, we'll have to get one written incredibly quickly. And I'd just like to have an example here. When Shane Warne, the Australian cricketer, died a couple of years ago, he died unexpectedly pretty young. And that was one of the most panicked days on the Times.
So you didn't have one for Shane
So we
Warne?
didn't have one, and I did not write it. I'm not a sports expert, but my colleague did.
I actually once had a net session next to Shane Warne.
Did you?
Yeah, in the Hampshire cricket ground. He was bowling
Oh,
his leg
la-da-da.
spin, and his wife, Liz Hurley, was in the gallery, which my mum was very excited about.
Oh my
Sorry.
God, we could have used that brilliant anecdote for the absolutely fascinating anecdote for the obituary, really illuminating. But so when Shane Warne died, my colleague Damien, who's brilliant and writes really well about sport, he had to write it within hours because this was an incredibly famous person and we probably should have had an obituary written. And my editor always uses it as this kind of fabled kind of warning to really get our stocks list up and ready. V-ill and V-old is the name of the stocks list.
There's something quite remarkable about the image in my head of your editor sort of casting an eye across the world, looking at who is famous, who's about to die.
The sort of Eye of Sauron.
Adding them to the list. And I suppose in keeping with that image, when you're writing these obituaries of people before they've died, presumably when you're doing your research, one of the best people to talk to about their life is themselves, is the person whose obituary you're writing. Is this something that you do? Do you ever interview people about their life for their obituary before they've died?
So it's incredibly rare to do that, partly because it's such an odd request to make of someone. One of the famous obituaries to have done this was someone called Alden Whitman, who was the New York Times' chief obituary writer from the kind of 60s, 70s, 80s. And he really revolutionized the craft because he would call up T.S. Eliot and say, can I come and see you? And sort of sit smoking a cigar in his office and noting down all of his quirks and his appearance in a way that you would do for a newspaper profile. And then he would write the obituary before they died. So in a sense, he was doing this long, long before me. But
was T.S. Eliot aware that that was the reason why they were hanging out?
I would.
Okay, so
Yeah,
he said,
yeah.
I want to ask you about your life because I think you're about to die.
Yeah. But I have done it a few times, and I did it once with a war correspondent whom I thought would take well to the proposition, since she had been working on the front lines of war zones. What was an obituarist asking to interview her before her death? What was that to that? And her response was really funny because she sort of replied and said, "Hi, Georgia. I have just recovered from COVID, so I don't know if you know something I don't. But yes, of course, what a strange request, but I'd be happy to." And we spoke, and it was so fascinating because there was a sense that she was opening up in a way she wouldn't with a normal journalist. She was telling me things that she had never told any journalist. There was a kind of story of a raucous affair with a world leader, which will come out when her obituary comes out. But I also did it with a novelist who also took well to the proposition. That was because I'd interviewed him for another obituary, and then I thought, oh, okay, maybe I'll just see if he'll want to be interviewed, and he said that was fine.
Has anyone ever said, "No, go away, you strange Grim Reaper, I don't want you anywhere"?
Do you know what? Well, actually, I went to a talk in London a couple of years ago that this woman was giving about her father, who was quite a famous cartoonist. I won't say his name, and I thought it was fascinating. I thought, oh, do you think we have an obituary? And I went up to her after the talk and said, it probably wasn't the time. I said, "Hi, I'm an obituarist, and I'd actually love to talk to you about your father because we'll probably be preparing an obituary." And she looked quite taken aback. And it probably wasn't the place or time. But I gave her my email, and we sort of did talk, but she definitely looked a bit startled, partly because it was her father. So I think she was not wanting to face up to the fact that he would die. But people generally have a slightly wry, bemused, kind of surprised reaction to being asked to chat about their life before their death.
Matthew Perry, you decided to write about him before he died as well.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about why you decided to write his obituary? Because he was not that old.
No, he was 54 when he died. And I had read his autobiography, which had just come out. And the first line of it said something like, "I should be dead, I shouldn't be here." Perry had been in and out of hospital for decades. He struggled with addiction and depression. And in 2019, his colon exploded from how many opiates he had been taken. So he had literally been in a coma for a couple of weeks. And it was that he was reacting to in his autobiography. So I read this, and it sounds really morbid, but I thought, okay, we should probably have an obituary on Matthew because he's so famous that when he dies, we will want to get this out as quickly as possible. And he has said himself that he has been at death's door many times. So I went to my editor and I said, I think we should get this obituary written, and I'd really like to write it myself. And I often do that if I really know something about a subject. I mean, I've been watching Friends since I was 10, over and over. Me and my siblings used to sit up all night watching it. We've seen it every episode about 5 times. So I understand Chandler Bing as a character. I understand Friends as a cultural concept and how it affected other sitcoms. So I felt like I was really keen to write this obituary. So I did. And I read his autobiography, which was harrowing and moving and very, very sad at points. And I of course, watched lots of Friends at the office. I had a great excuse to put my feet up and watch a sitcom at lunch, which is one of the brilliant quirks of my job. And I wrote this obituary, and then he died about 6 months later, which was such an odd feeling.
Well, it must be an odd feeling because you said earlier that you were very keen to write it because you're a fan of his. But it's strange because you can't have been keen for it to come out, because if it comes out, that means he's died. So that must give you a very peculiar relationship to your work where you want to write about these people, but then there's a certain sadness when your work appears in the public realm. Yeah,
you've really captured the paradox of it, because I had the same thing with someone called Terry Reid, who's this brilliant 60s musician who was a kind of soundtrack to my first love affair. He's this kind of country singer, if listeners don't know him. And I wrote his obituary beforehand, which I also asked to write because I was such a big fan. And then he died, and I felt so sad about it, but I also felt very close to him because I'd written this piece. And it was the same with Matthew Perry. I'd grown up with Matthew Perry. and Chandler, because the two are sort of inseparable, and we'll get on to that a bit later. But I was so seeped in the legend of Matthew Perry that it meant that I could write such a good piece on him in a way. You know, I think it was one of my best because I could really capture what he meant to millions of listeners. But it also was very sad. And now when I watch Friends, I as many people probably do, it's with a tinge of nostalgia and sadness.
So your editor agrees for you to write this piece because you've read Matthew Perry's autobiography. How do you then go about writing it? You know, this very loved, very complex figure. Sometimes with obituaries or with people's lives, there are certain snapshots that people use that are seen to be emblematic of this person, or who really kind of capture their life. Did you find moments like that in Matthew Perry's life, and what were they?
This is an interesting question because usually with obituaries, I will pick a moment in time that kind of encapsulated them, or a particular joke at a dinner party which tells us something about their humour, or I try and sum up the impact they made on a certain industry. Very often with actors and actresses, you really need to look at the character that most defined them, or the show that most defined them. Not because it necessarily defined them as a person, although with Matthew, I would argue that Chandler did, but because I mentioned at the beginning that obituaries are for readers and they are editorial and they are a mark of someone's legacy. For an actress or an actor, the role that they were most defined by is their legacy in a sense. And so I keep wanting to say Chandler. With Matthew Perry, it was such an easy decision, right? It was just, which bit of Chandler's story do I hone in on? Yeah. I knew that I was going to start with Chandler because not only is he defined by Chandler Bing, but he felt that he was Chandler Bing, as we had at the beginning. He felt like they were the same person. Not only because Chandler was an only child and lost and troubled and bad with women and funny and witty, but he used humour as a defence mechanism for this kind of great wealth of insecurity within him, which Matthew Perry had. But also because that character was shaped around Matthew Perry. So what happened in the audition process is that once they had decided who they wanted to cast, Lisa Kudrow, Jennifer Aniston, then they had these interviews with the actors and they said, tell us about you and about your relationships and about how you deal with the world and your humour. And then they built the characters around that, which I think is why Friends is so intimate and compelling, and why when you watch it, you feel like you really know them, because they're being played by people who are so similar to their characters. So for Chandler, it was everything I said before. So with that said, I wanted to start with a Friends anecdote that illuminated this contradictory comedy and darkness.
Right, and this is the bit where Chandler is psychoanalyzed on the couch of the coffee shop that they always hang out in by Phoebe's boyfriend.
You know, I don't know why you're so embarrassed. They were very nice boobies.
Nice? They were nice. I mean, that's it. I mean, mittens are nice.
Okay, Rock. Hard place. Me.
Yeah, you're so funny. He's really funny. I wouldn't want to be there when the laughter stops.
Whoa, back up there, Sparky. What did you mean by that?
Well, it just seems as though that maybe you have intimacy issues, you know, that you use your humor as a way of keeping people at a distance.
Huh.
I mean, hey, I just met you. I don't know you from Adam. Only child, right? Parents divorced before you hit puberty.
Uh-huh. How did you know that?
It's textbook.
And it's this great moment in Friends which comes every so often, because Friends is funny, right? But it's also, it's got a serious side and it's touching, as all sitcoms are. There's this moment when, you know, it's painfully true both about Chandler and also about Matthew Perry. I mean, Chandler does end up with Monica, right? He ends up adopting a child and getting married and moving to the suburbs in a way that Matthew Perry doesn't. And there's some sadness to that parallel, right? That his character manages to find a way out of the maelstrom of his head, and Chandler, oh my God, and Matthew Perry doesn't.
In a film that we talked about a bit last week, Citizen Kane, the whole point of the film is how do you capture someone's life? Is it possible to sum up someone's life? And the famous example in Citizen Kane is the word rosebud is the word that sums up Kane's life. And it's actually, I think at the end, it's etched onto the sledge, and it's sort of all about his childhood and where he came from. Do you think there's a word for Matthew Perry that captures him?
That is such an interesting question.
Because
If there was a word, so I'm now trying to think about whether there's a word for this. There's probably a German word for it, but comedy and darkness, that great kind of interplay between the sharpness of comedy. Because he was so funny, and he always used comedy as social currency. Like, ever since he was young, he realized that he could make people laugh at the class clown. And he always describes that moment of being like, right,
Yeah.
I know that comedy is going to be my way through the world. And in a sense, that comedy informed his romantic relationships, because there was a certain ironical distance. You know, he went out with Julia Roberts, but famously kind of dumped her because he was scared of getting too close. And it informed his character of Chandler, and it informed him as a person. But there was a dark sharpness to that humor. What did it veil beneath? Massive pools of insecurity.
yeah, because I think if you asked most people, they would probably say that, you know, the first bit of his life is defined by laughter, and then the second bit is defined by drugs or substance abuse, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that
or,
seems,
or darkness.
and that
or
seems
darkness.
to be the trajectory. And when you're writing an obituary of someone, because you only have, what is it, 1,500 words, something
Yeah,
like
I mean,
that?
Chandler would have been about 2,000, but yeah.
So you've not got a huge amount of space to play with in the way that as a historian you have an entire book. I mean, if you were going to write a biography of Matthew Perry, you could explore all of the different nuances and
sort of the psychology behind it. There's really interesting psychology.
whereas, and this is why I brought up Citizen Kane and this rosebud thing, because I feel like with obituaries there is this sense that you have to capture someone in a very small amount of words. You have to capture their essence, which must be so difficult for someone like Matthew Perry, where they had this very contradictory and sprawling and chaotic life. How you boil that down to an essence without reducing him to a character in a TV show or a drug addict, that must be a real challenge, particularly when this character is so beloved and people have vastly different perspectives on their life.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point, and it's the great pressure of being an obituarist, especially for actors or public figures who are so beloved. I kept thinking, are people going to read this and really feel like they've come away with an understanding of who Matthew Perry was? And of course you are limited by the word count, and I would have loved to have written a book on Matthew Perry, although of course he did that himself. He wrote the autobiography, and hopefully with an obituary your interest can be piqued, and you can then go away and read the autobiography or watch Friends or read all the articles about him. Obituaries aren't trying to be comprehensive book-length biography of someone. They're meant to give a kind of taste of someone's importance in the world, a kind of snapshot. And yes, of course, that is limiting, but it's also incredibly beneficial because it means people actually read it start to finish.
But I suppose, again, that must be the difficulty of it, you know, this task of doing a snapshot of someone's life. If they're very famous, particularly maybe if they're a political figure, so not necessarily someone like Matthew Perry, but a politician who dies, presumably people are going to write in and say, you've completely got this wrong. You know, this man or woman was a monster. How could you possibly give them this sort of slightly glowing obituary? And then I suppose at the same time, with less famous people, you run the risk of their family members writing in and saying, well, this isn't them at all. You've completely missed the point of this person, because presumably you wouldn't have met them. You wouldn't have been able to watch them on YouTube. So family members could in a sort of fair enough way, say, well, he wasn't like that at all. That was not what his mannerisms were like. I mean, is that something that happens often, that you have people writing in saying you've not captured this person?
Yeah, and actually, the distinction you make is interesting, because when it's public figures, people feel a sense of ownership over their legacy and their memory. And you definitely get people writing in the comments, usually underneath, sort of, this doesn't capture them, or you've made them seem like this, or...
Do you read the comments?
I do, actually, because usually on obituaries, unlike most other bits of the paper, the comments are actually really good. And I love reading that someone feels like you've captured them. I mean, there is no greater joy to my job than that. And actually, with family members, it's slightly more personal, right? Because when a family member is writing in and saying, you haven't captured them, we're really upset, that can be a really, really upsetting part of the job. Right. And thankfully, that doesn't happen very often. But when it does, it's difficult to deal with, because you have to remember that grief is an incredibly complex emotional journey. And for a family to see their loved one represented in a certain way by someone who didn't know them is tricky. But then on the other hand, far more often, I do get people saying, I can't believe you've captured them in such a way you didn't even know them. And then that can be unbelievably rewarding, and you take the good with the bad.
So I suppose people writing in and complaining that you haven't captured them is one thing. Another thing is, I suppose, people not reading obituaries at all. My sense is younger people, because they're not subscribing to the Times, behind a paywall, or the New York Times or the Guardian or whatever, are not reading obituaries as much. And actually, what happens when someone dies is most of the commentary on their life is going on online, on TikTok, on Instagram. Have you ever seen any of this commentary? I mean, do you watch some of these videos? I mean, for example, when Liam Payne died,
Yeah,
the
that's
One
a good
Direction
one.
star, there was lots and lots of commentary online. Or when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, lots and lots of commentary about that online, driven primarily by younger people. Is this something you engage with, and what's your view on that way of memorializing the dead? Or memorializing is perhaps a grandiose term, I suppose, discussing the dead.
Yeah, so I actually, often with people like Liam Payne or actors or public figures, I go onto kind of Reddit threads and Instagram threads and Facebook threads and see what people said about them, because it can be incredibly illuminating seeing people, how people remember someone. So I recently did someone called Nicholas Brendan, who was a member of the cast of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which was a sort of cult TV show to match Friends. And I hadn't seen Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which I then again put up my feet at the office and watched, much to the consternation of the news desk, who were kind of growling behind me. But I watched it, so I got a taste. But I also went onto Reddit and kind of read all about how people viewed his character and the importance to the show and how the character changes, and that was so useful. And Buffy the Vampire Slayer actor is a really good example of someone who was pretty young when he died. So I was trying to tap into this kind of younger zeitgeisty thing online. But this kind of leads me on to my next point, which is about obituaries being this kind of, as you say, old-fashioned form of journalism behind a paywall. People see it as very fusty, partly because it's about death, and we don't like to look death in the eye, particularly in Britain. So people have a slightly hazy, strange view of obituaries.
Well, it's arguably one of the most maligned jobs in romantic comedies. I mean, every
Oh God,
time,
yeah. Oh my God.
every time you want to have a character,
Apart from Jude Law being so hot.
Yes, the Jude Law is hot, and this is obviously the film Closer, the famous obituarist Jude Law, but he also does describe himself as a journalist, sort of a journalist.
I know, they're always sort of like, they get fired from the news desk and they get dumped into the
Siberia of journalism.
The Siberia of journalism, which actually is what Alden Whitman, the New York Times obituarist who I mentioned earlier, he famously kind of was about to retire, and they were like, actually, we'll just put you in the kind of like death zone. And he was like, oh, for God's sake. And then he turned it around, right? He made it into this interesting craft. And now I would like to say to listeners, within journalism circles, it's got a certain reverence. But outside of journalism circles, when people don't know really what obituaries are, I mean, the amount of times people kind of stare at me, they're like, you're an obituarist? Oh God, that's very morbid. And I once went on a date with this guy who sort of said, oh, does that involve going to funerals with a notepad and pen? And I was like, No, I'm not like a grave digger.
I actually think that's actually a very fair question to it. I mean, presumably watching
Yeah.
eulogies or
Well, actually,
soaking
I
in-
do use eulogies in my obituaries. People send me eulogies, which can be incredibly illuminating, and there's always a sort of stench of death to to a eulogy.
I mean, you mentioned that it's a sort of fusty, it's seen sometimes as a fusty part of journalism. It's obviously very associated with print journalism. To finish, I mean, what do you think the future is for obituaries? I mean, is it going to live and die with print journalism, which is possibly a medium which is, if not on its way out, then certainly undergoing some significant challenges at the moment?
I mean, I think it is so surprising that obituaries have not found their way into the digital world, into the social media world. As you say, people love to pay tribute to people who've died on social media, and yet the form of obituaries, which is arguably far more artistic than a kind of obsequious tribute, that form has not found its way into the younger generation's kind of orbit. And I hope this podcast changes that in a way, because these are stories about life. They're celebrations of life. They're not even celebrations of life. They're just great yarns about what it means to be human and about various points in history. I mean, it's history, it's biography, it's stories, and the fact that we don't, as a younger generation, kind of have access to that in an interesting and meaningful way, unless you do read obituaries, is to me a great shame.
Yeah, and I think that when someone dies and there is the social media discourse around their death, some of it is quite lovely. And I remember when Matthew Perry died, there's lots of people celebrating it and posting clips of him on Friends, and there's this sort of collective aspect to the memorialization, which I think is quite sweet. But also what you notice is it does mean that people's lives are often reduced not only to 2,000 words or whatever, but to a tweet essentially, or to a tiny snapshot. And I suppose we can finish maybe by thinking about the Citizen Kane thing about, the point of that film is that you actually can't capture someone's life in one word or in a sentence, and someone's life is complex, and you do need a slightly longer form of journalism or podcasting in order to try and capture that person's life in all its richness and fullness.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Last Rites. Join us next week where we will be exploring another fascinating life.